This video focuses on the economic, social, and political philosophy articulated by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, particularly. It's worthwhile to have two pieces of vocabulary in mind as we read the manifesto. One is the proletariat, which simply refers to the working class. This would be the 99%, the have-nots, the poor, and the bourgeoisie, or bourgeois, a French term for the class that is made up of the owners of the means of production, where the means of production refers to the factories, the resources and land, etc. When we look at the Communist Manifesto, what we find is that it's extraordinarily short. In a Microsoft Word document, it's 20 pages. My personal copy on my bookshelf is thin. It's an hour or two of reading, max. It's incredibly short. The significance of this is that those few pages change the history of the world. There are few better representations for the power of ideas to shape reality than considering the 90 or 120 short pages of Marx's Communist Manifesto and the effect on the shape of world history, as well as the blood and violence which they inspire. My discussion of Karl Marx I'll make overly simplistic, but I think the ideas can be grasped in a straightforward way. There are a few sorts of big criticisms of communism, especially in practice. And I think the biggest one has to do with absolute power. In Marx's communism, politically, there is only one party that is legitimate. That would be the Communist Party, or the Working Party, the Workers' Party. Since there's no other party that can act as a check and balance, like we have theoretically with a two-party system, some people debate whether we really have much choice either. An interesting criticism. But with no check or balance on the Communist Party, it becomes bloated and corrupt. It might be worthwhile to also criticize the American governmental bureaucracy as significantly bloated and perhaps also corrupt. There are quite good arguments supporting those claims. This is important because many of the criticisms we can level against communism likely also equally apply to some of our social structures. The second order criticism of communism I will provide at the outset has to deal with top-down organization. When someone at the top, or some small group at the top, is attempting to mastermind the entire social structure, including its economy, that is likely a less efficient and less pleasurable form of social organization than one that's more organic, grassroots, or bottom-up. There are interesting debates around those things, so I won't go into detail, and I'll leave you to meddle in the curiosities. It might also be worth pointing out, before we go into the text itself, the difference between communism and socialism. Communism is a type of socialism, but not all forms of socialism are communism. Specifically, the difference is that communism involves the nationalization of all industries, whereas socialism involves the nationalization of at least some industries, but not all. The American political economy is what's called mixed, or a mixed economy. It has elements of laissez-faire, free market capitalism, as well as elements of socialism. Some industries are nationalized. Nationalization refers to the government taking ownership and public control of an industry. For example, Canadian healthcare, or healthcare in the United Kingdom, is socialized. It's public. It's government-run. Part of the idea for why is, in capitalism, if you don't have money, you don't receive goods or services. There's a moral question about whether the poor should suffer when the medical technology to ease their suffering exists. And the only barrier is what's called fiat currency. Dollar bills that are made up and have no intrinsic value. Which is not an argument for the gold standard. That's a different issue. Communism takes things like agriculture and puts it under government control. The automobile industry and under government control. Media communication, completely state-owned. These, in our mixed economy, are not nationalized. They're market-based. But there are other elements of our economy that are socialized. Whereas we have not socialized medicine and healthcare. And if we desired to, we could choose to. A few years ago, there was an argument that if we socialized healthcare, it would somehow lead down a slippery slope to Nazi Germany. That's patently untrue. When we look at countries that do provide universal healthcare, like England and Canada, and many others too, we find they're not post-apocalyptic wastelands. Instead, they're just fine, if not a little better off. One of the largest socialist programs in the American political economy is the United States military. Notice that people don't exclusively hire out private armies. We have a national army, paid for and run by the central government, not by the free market. The same is true of police forces. The police are a socialist organization. Everybody pays a little bit in, and everybody benefits. That's socialism. And you pay whether you want to or not, and whether you use them or not. Public schools are socialist. We'll see Marx making an argument for them. And so had Plato. The idea is that regardless of whether a child is poor or rich, they deserve the same education, funded in common by the public at large. Should we take the same approach to housing, food, or medicine? Is a debate our society can have about how much or how little socialism would be best or is politically desirable. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the FDA, are socialist organizations. We all pay into them. They're handled by central public government, and we all benefit from them. The free market, without the FDA, would say, if your dog or your child takes poisoned medicine and they die, it'll teach you and others to be a more savvy consumer in the future. That's the free market. Whoops! Guess you learned for next time. Part of the reason why the EPA exists is because during what was called the Gilded Age, in the late Industrial Revolution, there was so much pollution going into some American rivers that the Chicago River would from time to time catch on fire. You may or may not know much about chemistry, but rivers aren't normally flammable. We enjoy public utilities like water systems, sewage treatment, and Clean Air and Clean Water Acts as socialist programs. To give them up would be, likely, all of our own peril. So all we're really debating in discussions about communism and socialism and capitalism is where on that spectrum we want to fall. The recent failed run for the Democratic nomination for president by Bernie Sanders, uniquely as a democratic socialist, represents an attempt to rectify the one-party system and its bloated bureaucratic corruption of communism. Communism only has one party. A number of nations, such as Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands and France, have democratic socialism, somewhat more socialist institutions than we do, but democratic control rather than absolute one-party control of those institutions. Let's turn now to the text of the Communist Manifesto itself. And what we'll find is a striking relevance, even given that the text is over 150 years old, to issues our world finds today. Marx is prescient or clairvoyant. He seems to see the writing on the wall for globalization and global capitalism, even when these trends are in their infancy. "50 or so years ago, getting on towards 65 now, if I had read through with you what I'm about to read through, I would never teach again. I would be blacklisted to discuss communism, both its advantages as well as disadvantages, was a thought crime for which I could be imprisoned. It's worthwhile to pay special attention to books that people don't want discussed, like this and many of the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, which share a time period with Marx. People don't want you talking about these things because they threaten to upset the established order and have the danger of throwing the powerful out of power. For Nietzsche, the dangers to the church. For Marx, the dangers to the rich elite, of which you are not. If you were, you wouldn't be listening to this recording right now. You'd be at Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Duke, or Brown. It is worth noting that in global terms, you are the rich. You and your family have clean water, medicine, likely a number of automobiles. Who knows how many internet-connected electronic devices you and your family possess. And you have the benefit, no matter how you might or might not struggle, of a college education. One of the important realizations about the Communist Manifesto and the ideas of class antagonism it expresses are that while you're not affluent in American terms, in global terms, you absolutely are. So while we might desire to pull down the rich of our own country, those ideas globalized likely spell less comfortability for us. Without Chinese and Southeast Asian sweatshops, you or I wouldn't have our electronics. Without the destruction of the polar ice caps, we wouldn't drive anywhere. Allow those to serve as food for thought to chew over before we get too far ahead of ourselves or think that Marx's advocacy for revolution is advisable. Those are tough moral questions. The manifesto starts in a characteristic and well-known way. It says, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies." Marx's first chapter starts this way, that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. Notice that in our discussion, this is the very first time oppressor and oppressed and oppression has entered into our vocabulary. Feminism already gets enough grief from our society, but in fact, a number of the feminist critical ideologies have a heritage, at least through Marxism, which is an early proponent of that sort of language, which, while appropriate, is largely not appreciated by those in power in various societies. For Marx's political economy, the rich don't like discussion of oppression. For patriarchy and feminism, it's men. In this next section, take a look at how relevant this discussion is to issues our society faces today. Marx writes, "The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionists, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations. By industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every corner of the globe. In place of the old wants, satisfied by the productions of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climates. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, We have intercourse in every direction. Universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible. And from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. Notice that it's Saudi Arabian oil. Oil from under the Arctic that flows to Europe and the US. That it's African gold and diamonds that flow out in a sort of new or post-colonialism to China, Europe, and America. And when the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche reach the shores of Islamic North Africa, or a Burger King advertisement reaches Kabul, Afghanistan, using a woman in a bikini to sell a bacon cheeseburger, that this national one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness comes into conflict with globalization, or global capitalism, because the more people we can sell to, the more money the capitalists can make, as if they don't have enough. But there are other arguments too. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In a word, it creates a world after its own image. Marx is speaking in the telegraph era. Not even the radio, not the television, not the internet and YouTube, satellite communication era. How much more so, everyone has to be remade in the American image. Not only is this fraught with difficulties in a multicultural context, certainly also there are not enough raw materials on Earth for everyone to live at the standard of living that we do. Nevertheless, the world is trying. Where does that put us? That's the context of the 21st century world you inhabit. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, or capital, is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat, the modern working class, developed. A class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. Marx's claim, and one of the many reasons he's so very disliked, is that he equates the capitalist economy with prostitution. That we, in the capitalist market, prostitute ourselves to eat. His argument, as we'll see, is that so long as the workers compete with each other, the beneficiaries will be the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, the owners, the upper class. To give this an image, so long as you and everyone else taking this class is fighting with everyone else for a limited number of jobs, if I can pay one person $10 an hour to do a job, maybe I can find someone who will do it for $9. And if I can find someone who will do it for $9, likely I can find someone even more desperate who will do it for $8. And down and down and down. Until we reach the lowest wage humanly imaginable. For Marx, that is the point of capitalism. To keep the laborers in competition with each other, fighting for the lowest wages possible. This has an other side to it, which is that prices also are somewhat lower for the consumers. But, as he will explain, when the people doing the consumption don't have enough to consume with, his logic is this system cannot perpetuate. His answer to this is labor unions, an association of the workers. As we'll see, and I'll preview now, the owners of the Walmart company, for example, do zero work. They don't work at all. And they're paid billions. No individual human being is alone responsible for billions of dollars worth of work. The people who are generating billions of dollars in profit are the people who actually make the things, being paid pennies in the third world. And the individual wage earners, the cashiers and the stockers, the low-level managers. Without those people, Walmart doesn't make squat. But Marx's analysis is that the rich are exploiting the poor to enrich themselves and keep the poor in poverty, so they keep coming back to work. Let's see how this continues. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character, and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. Nay, more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by increase of the work exacted in a given time, or by increased speed of the machinery, etc. I know I, for example, worked in retail for many years during college, and I found that work to be soul-sucking, soul-crushing. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. Marx's reason why is that you're a machine. You're doing the work of a trained monkey. You're not leading a fulfilling human life. What he's also beginning to hint at, and will make even more explicit later, is not only the first time we see discussion of what's called the minimum wage, but even more so that the point of capitalism, in paying people as little as is humanly possible to survive, will provide only the barest means of subsistence. If an employer only pays his employees enough to barely get by, to live paycheck to paycheck, as the majority of Americans do, then the employee has to keep coming back to work. He's caught. Toss in a little credit card or student loan debt, and Marx's language is one of economic slavery. Slavery with all the benefits, lacking only the chains. Now, you can debate, as people have, whether this is accurate or inaccurate analysis. But wage or debt slavery is now in the discussion. And being paid just barely enough to survive is Marx's analysis. The question is he right or wrong? Finishing out this section, modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is. Marx's criticism that capitalism is slavery, you can see why this text would have been banned in a capitalist society. He writes, "No sooner is the exploitation of the laborer by the manufacturer so far at an end than he receives his wages in cash, than he is set upon by the other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, etc. Later thinkers and philosophers will use the language of late advanced industrial capitalism to describe the political economy we find ourselves in today. By this point, advanced late capitalism has nearly reached perfection. In Marx's analysis, nearly perfect slavery. While that is probably too strong an analysis and criticism, because of the structures and choices in our political society, there's a smaller and smaller percentage of your generation which will own your own home. A much higher percentage, very likely because of anti-unionization policies since the 1970s, will result, and has resulted, in a greater proportion of this generation being renters. What money comes in goes right back out. This is Marx's prescient analysis. He can see where things are headed, very likely. One of the important considerations we can keep in mind is Marx's analysis of the failures of capitalism is largely on point. It's his answer. One-party communism, top-down state control. That's amiss. If his criticism is accurate, but his solution is bad, we are halfway to dealing with the problem of income inequality. At least we know what the problems are, even if we haven't come up with a decent solution yet. That we're still waiting on, waiting for somebody to deal with. Someone will. Marx writes that the proletarian is without property. His relation to his wife and children has no longer anything in common with the bourgeois family relations. Modern industrial labor, modern subjection to capital, the same in England as in France, in America as in Germany, has stripped him of every trace of national character. Law, morality, religion are to him so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. When Marx writes the proletarian is without property, what he means is that the vast majority of you and the vast majority of your parents don't even own an acre of land. Whether or not you should is an interesting question. Marx has been accused of a nostalgic pastoralism. He wants everybody to be a farmer, which you might find would be boring and suck. But don't be confused that if you claim, but I have property, I have a car I pay for all the time and will break down around the time that I pay it off. I have an iPhone that I pay a service fee for, which enslaves me month by month to my job. And perhaps you'll get a house with a 1/4 acre of land, maybe even 1 or 2. But you're not amassing wealth. You're making barely enough to get by, and barely enough to raise the next generation who will make barely enough to get by. I can't emphasize how important that is. This claim here stands nearly alone in the manifesto, but it's worth consideration. Is the purpose of the drug war and its law, morality, and puritanical religious basis, are those really to serve public safety? Or the, what some have come to call, prison industrial complex? Both a bloated and somewhat even corrupt justice system, or the private prisons, which are centers of profit. These claims can be argued against. You can see why they would be considered radical and revolutionary. The question is this analysis accurate? And if not, perhaps the burden is on the disputer. What makes them inaccurate? What is evidence to the contrary? That may be just me pushing blame. But it's also possible Marx is exposing something. And it's tough to tell. He wraps up this all-important first section with the following paragraphs. We'll go through them. And we're nearly done. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities or in the interest of minorities. The Proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interests of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest stratum of our present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. I'm going to skip just a little bit. In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we traced the more or less veiled civil war raging within existing society, up to the point where that war breaks out into open revolution, and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat. That is, the 99% for the 99%. Hitherto, every form of society has been based, as we have already seen, on the antagonism of oppressing and oppressed classes. But in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it, under which it can, at least, continue its slavish existence. The serf in the period of serfdom raised himself to membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeois, under the yoke of feudal absolutism, managed to develop into a bourgeois. The modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, that is, a poor person. And pauperism, or poverty, develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society, and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. What Marx is expressing is that food stamps and welfare, of the sort many Walmart or McDonald's employees are forced to resort to, don't exist in spite of capitalism. Marx's argument is that they exist because of it. Because the point of capitalism, in Marx's view, is to pay people as little as is humanly possible. And if it can get the government to fill the gap, all the better for the capitalist and his profiteering. The essential condition for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition for capital is wage labor. Wage labor rests exclusively on competition between the laborers. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition by their revolutionary combination due to association. The development of modern industry therefore cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces, above all, is its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. I'll just paraphrase the last few of some of this. Marx says it's not that he's intending to take away property from everyone. He's intending to take it away from the rich and give it to the have-nots, the poor. Robin Hood fashion. His language of not only oppression but exploitation is that the only reason the rich have what they have is by screwing over the people who work for them. You can see why this sort of thinking was so very dangerous to America in the 1950s, at least to those in power, when they feared that the laborers would catch on to Marx's idea. Communism in practice, when it comes to Mao Zedong and his Cultural Revolution, was horrific. Communism under Lenin and Stalin, equally oppressive and horrific. We'll take a look at Ayn Rand's counter-arguments, for good reason. Communism in Cuba, a mixed bag of oppression, poverty, but democratic socialism around the world has produced some of the most astounding results in terms of human achievement and equality. The philosophy of economics is not easy. It's not easy for me. It's not easy for the world's most brilliant minds. But the application of the mind to issues of inequitable wealth distribution is likely valuable. So, if we criticize either Marx or communism in practice, that should only provide us better fodder for understanding what to watch out for and what can be done better in the future. More issues we've already discussed, so I'll continue. Discussion of the minimum wage, which gives a bare existence, which we've discussed. I'll let Marx speak for himself here. He's addressing his critics, detractors, and people objecting. He writes, "You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. But in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. You reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society." It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease, and universal laziness will overtake us. But, according to this line of thinking, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness, for those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. Marx's point here is considerable. There's this idea that if people have their needs met, no one will work. However, as he had already pointed out, the vast majority of our society and around the world involves people who are not profiting from their labor. These people, and likely you, are not amassing wealth from their work. Well, they keep going anyways. That may likely have to do something with the state of slavery he had analyzed. How those things work out, still interesting. But there are other reasons why people do things. I, for example, if I had my needs met, would still want to discuss philosophy every day and share what I know. A doctor very often isn't making bank anymore. Medical school is obscenely expensive. Malpractice insurance is very expensive. And profit margins for doctors are getting thinner and thinner. Likely, it's not profit that motivates the doctor, the nurse, the policeman, or the firefighter to go to work. It's fulfillment, desire, meaning, and purpose, at least in significant proportion. You can almost hear the snicker of Marx across 150 years. The culture, the loss of which he laments, is, for the enormous majority, a mere training to act as a machine. Marx wants to return us our humanity. Is this overly aggrandized? Maybe so, maybe not. His argument for universal public education, you see here. A proto-feminist idea that women in the society of his time are mere machines for making more people. And criticisms of the rich and their adulterous lifestyles. In proportion as the exploitation of one individual by another is put an end to, the exploitation of one nation by another will also be put an end to. In proportion as the antagonism between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will come to an end. Perhaps. I'll let you take a look here. Number 3 is a stickler, isn't it? Oh, number 4 is a little tough too. I don't see any reason why number 5 would cause an issue. That's sarcasm. How's this working out for China? That's innuendo. 7's not too bad. Maybe on number 8. Doesn't look very nice in North Korea or Cuba. Number 9, not too bad. Free education for all in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor. Combination of education with industrial production. If we're talking job training, not horrible. If we're talking kids making Christmas toys, much worse. I'm going to skip down to the end. Marx leaves the second half of the discussion for historical and geopolitical analysis. It's more relevant to his time period or historians than to us. In short, the communists everywhere support the revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite! And thus ends one of the most powerful essays in human history. For considerable ill, and for some small good here and there. I leave you at this point to pick apart the rest of which is which.